So one of the things that we often come across is people that are not really aware of the financial world, and that's really by design. There's a lot in the industry, whether it's analysts or financial advisors, that want you to think it's an extremely complicated world. And one thing that we like to do is, empower people to realize that they are able to find this information out on their own. And just an example, recently I had a friend who, was telling me what their financial advisor did with their money, and it was a bit shocking in terms of putting like 85% into an IPO and just absolutely no risk management whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, you have super flagrant offenses like that as well, but I think if you can check your own retirement accounts and see how they're managed. If you have a bunch of realized losses, right, and your account is exactly flat, all of those gains over that time are probably going. So you see this, I mean, I have seen this personally looking over, my own family's accounts. So I know firsthand, what it is, and you're incentivized, right, to convince the general public that it's too challenging to do it. So it would make sense, and at the same time, it's unethical.
What's the difference between fiduciary and
So if you're a fiduciary, you're legally obligated to act in your client's best interest. But the thing is, in a court of law, right, you can just argue, I thought I was doing the best I could. It's completely subjective. It doesn't really hold that much weight, even though if you are going to find an advisor, it is better if you find a fiduciary. But most of these guys aren't. Most of these financial advisors, anybody can be a financial advisor. It's not really much of a title at all. So yeah, it's a tricky world out there.
So make sure you're doing your own research and empowering yourself. The internet has everything you want to learn on it, and it just takes a little bit of time. So one thing about Lamont here, just observing him as a mentor and his style, is he goes very in-depth into both the technical aspect of things as well as the psychological. And it's interesting to observe how people respond to that. I'll see him post some things on Twitter, and I'll read it and be like, that's going to go over 98% of people's heads because it's too advanced, it's too in-depth. But when he goes really in-depth into the psychological aspects, it really resonates a lot easier with a lot of people. And so it's interesting to observe that dichotomy where it's almost like a more universal understanding people have with the psychological aspect of things that's very beneficial with how in-depth you go.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. That's quite a compliment. Yeah, I mean, the way that I just don't really do things lightly. If I do a thing, I have high conviction. I go all in. And I think with the psychological stuff, like you were saying, it's very intuitive. I like to say the path is not really one of learning, but one of like realizing and remembering, because many of the psychological things you already intuitively know. It's just that social conditioning has led you away from these things, right? Even in ways that are more subtle than you realize. Like, for example, probably the most famous example would be like women, right? Women's body image when it comes to like, the magazine covers and, what kind of female leads are within, Hollywood all the time. These kinds of subtle things affect your psychology. They make you forget, how you inherently have value, right? How you don't need to do a thing, you don't need to be any other way. You translate that into the markets, and it's a lot harder because I think when people have a technical system, right, they're trying to say, okay, this must be this way because it is as this. But the reality is with a technical system is you just want clarity, right? You have objective clarity, calling it exactly for what it is. And I think that's harder for many people to resonate because there are so many ways in which you can establish that clarity, right? It's like a spiritual practice. If that helps you find center, that helps you find center.
Told you. And what about your use of analogies? You use those a lot.
Oh yeah. So the way that I see it, there's a very good lecture by Professor Hofstadter called "Analogy is the Core of Cognition." And when I heard that, I realized that's absolutely true. Everything that you learn is an analog of something else, right? Like my favorite example that Professor Hofstadter uses is he compares all these cultures, different traditional cultures, and how they perceive space and time. So that if someone were to say, oh, I'm gonna go do that tomorrow, and they would do this hand motion, and that's like, they intuitively understand the connection of moving forward in time and moving forward in space. And the interesting thing is that some cultures have it reversed, so that they would say, I'm going to do that in the future. And so they would flip that, right? So what does that suggest? That suggests that they've developed an analog that is opposite to the majority, but it works for them because it's a consistent reference, because it's an analog. And so, if you think about it, everything is analog, right?